I knew thousands of people were leaving their homes and were probably never going to get to go back to them. And in the middle of that chaos, I had to find ways to talk to people about what they were experiencing.
That was my house.
It's all gone.
I think hearing one person's story helps viewers trust what they're hearing. Because when you can empathise with one person's experience, it helps you get an understanding of the bigger picture.
Live from Washington, this is BBC News. Russian President Vladimir Putin offers direct talks with Ukraine in Istanbul next week. Ukraine has yet to respond. It comes after European leaders with US backing proposed a 30-day ceasefire with sanctions should Russia not comply. And India accuses Pakistan of repeated violations after a US-mediated ceasefire came into effect earlier today. Pakistan says that it remains committed to the truce terms. I'm Helena Humphrey, good to have you with us. We're starting with some breaking news on the war in Ukraine. In the past few minutes, Russian President Vladimir Putin has offered what he called immediate direct talks with Ukraine. He said that they would take place in Istanbul on the 15th of May and would focus on, quote, the root causes of the conflict. Well, President Putin added that Russia does not rule out agreements on a new ceasefire as part of those talks. There's been no response yet from Ukraine on whether they will accept that offer. It comes just after a 3-day unilateral Russian ceasefire expired. Now, European leaders had earlier proposed an unconditional 30-day truce starting on Monday. With renewed pressure on Russia, they threatened Russian President Vladimir Putin with new massive sanctions if they failed to comply. Well, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, Poland, as well as Ukraine, made the announcement in Kiev, where they held a phone call securing the backing of US President Donald Trump. Our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman, travelled to Kiev and sent this report.
Solidarity arriving on the sleeper train. Sir Keir Starmer's second visit to Ukraine as Prime Minister, but his first with company.
What do we do now?
What now? First, solemnity. These flags at Kiev's Independence Square commemorate Ukraine's war dead. Then a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, the rest of its 30 or so members patched in by video link. Today they agreed on a specific demand.
Since Monday, 12th of May, a full and unconditional ceasefire must start for at least 30 days, we together demanded from Russia.
In a week where we commemorated the end of a war in Europe, these European leaders have come here to Kyiv to see a war in Europe. This is a deliberately symbolic visit. It's designed as a response to Putin and his posse of leaders in Moscow the day before. For Ukraine, these days bring clarity. Who's with them and who's against them.
We end our press conference.
But who's America with? President Trump first suggested the 30-day plan. After the group meeting, President Macron got his phone out and dialed him up. Historical moments, the caption read. The early signs from Russia aren't promising. Shove these peace plans, the former President Dmitry Medvedev said.
We haven't seen unity like this pretty well throughout the conflict. So to get the European allies, US,
but Russia are
New
saying
Zealand,
shove these peace plans.
Canada, all on one page. Putin, of course, cannot be trusted, but this now is a unified call for an unconditional ceasefire, backed up by sanctions.
Unity, solidarity, willingness, none of these are in doubt. But is it enough to justify these leaders' faith that they can change the course of this war? Henry Zeffman, BBC News, Kyiv.
Well, joining me live now is a former US ambassador to NATO and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Ivo Dalda. Welcome to you. Very good to have you with us. Let's just start with that breaking news that we have had in the past few minutes. President Putin saying that he is proposing direct talks with Ukraine in Istanbul from May the 15th. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's an effort to change the dialogue from what happened over the last 24 hours, the meeting with the European leaders that President Zelensky had in Kyiv today with the backing of the United States, saying it's time for a ceasefire. It's long past time for a ceasefire. And if that doesn't happen, sanctions will be imposed, further sanctions, including with the backing of the United States. So it now looks like West is once again united, and Mr. Putin feels cornered. Whether this should be accepted, the direct talks, is something for the Ukrainians to decide. But ultimately, talking when the war continues is going to be extremely difficult. Much better for Mr. Putin also to agree to a ceasefire and then having direct talks.
Exactly. That's a really important point to make, because the call from the European leaders and Volodymyr Zelensky today has been, let's have a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. Early comments that we've had from Russia suggesting that perhaps they're not seeing that as an attractive proposal. But surely having this ceasefire first could be seen as something of a confidence-building measure before going into these talks.
Exactly. And I think what the Russians are trying to do here is to find a way out of a predicament that they have found themselves in, which is that they were hoping to split the West, that in the last 100 or so days, President Trump tried in every which way he could to satisfy Russian demands and push the Ukrainians. That didn't seem to work. President Trump seems to understand that the real root cause of this problem is Vladimir Putin and Russia and the fact that they have invaded a neighboring country. And he is now willing to do what the United States did before he became president, to unite with Western allies to put the pressure back on Russia. That's where it belongs. The Russians now need to decide: will they continue to fight the war, reject an unconditional ceasefire, offer something like talks about, quote, root causes, which we know what they mean. They mean the subjugation of Ukraine in Russia's point of view. And then try to call the West bluff. My view is that the West is now more united, finally, again, in a way that we haven't seen since President Trump was inaugurated. And the hope is now that that pressure will finally get where we need to go, end this war and have Russia withdraw its troops.
I wonder how effective you think this pressure could be. I mean, we heard, for example, the European leaders saying, the so-called coalition of the willing, that they could use further sanctions against Russia if they don't agree to this unconditional ceasefire. Because the question I will raise is that there have been sanctions on Russia for an awful long time now. Do you think that pressure will really add anything this time around?
It could. President Macron has talked about further banking sanctions, which will hurt, and sanctions on oil, something that the U.S. is also contemplating. A bill is now making its way in the U.S. Senate that would put secondary sanctions on any country that actually purchases oil from Russia, and that could actually reduce demand for Russian oil. We're also in a time when there is an oil glut, when we have prices are seeming to rise, to fall, because there is so much oil already on the market. The OPEC Plus has agreed to pump more oil. So this is a very good time to squeeze the Russians on that particular perspective, including those who are continuing to buy Russian oil. So yes, I think real pressure is still possible, and can and should be implemented if this 30-day ceasefire is not started unconditionally as demanded.
If we see this ceasefire, or were we to see, for example, these talks in Istanbul, depending on what the Ukrainians decide, I wonder what you think about the prospects of a more lasting peace. I mean, you were mentioning these large gaps between both sides. Ukraine wants security guarantees. The concern from the Kremlin is essentially that with a robust Ukrainian army or European troops on the ground, that then they could have the ability to retake areas that are being held by Russia. these sides are so far apart still?
Yeah, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to get negotiations not only started but actually concluded, given that, as you rightly say, the sides are so far apart. I mean, the essence of the deal we already know. We know that at some point Ukraine will have to accept that regaining the territory it has lost through military means is something that may not be possible. And at the same time, Russia will have to understand that Ukraine cannot trust Russia, will not be in a position to trust Russia, therefore needs a strong, significant military force and needs to have security guarantees. That is where this is going to end sooner. And the question is what is going to end sooner rather than later. That is really up to the Russians and to the Ukrainians to decide. It's not up to us. They will have to decide whether the costs of continuing the war outweigh the benefits of ending it under the right kinds of terms. But at least we now have the kind of pressure that we should have had all along of trying to get to a ceasefire and then to a negotiation. And if that fails, we all know why. It will fail because Russia is not interested in a peace. Russia wants war. It's what it has been trying to do for the last 11 years, in fact, since 2014. And if it wants war, then the West needs to stand with Ukraine to make sure that it doesn't succeed.
Ivo Dalda, former US ambassador to NATO and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Really good to have you with us. Thanks for your thoughts on this developing story as President Putin offers direct talks with Ukraine. Now, a ceasefire deal between India and Pakistan is off to a fragile start less than 12 hours after being introduced. India has accused Pakistan of, quote, repeated violations and says that its armed forces are giving, quote, an appropriate response. But Pakistan says that it remains committed to the truce. Well, these were the sights and sounds of explosions over Indian-administered Kashmir hours after the ceasefire was announced. Pakistan denies violating the ceasefire and later alleged, quote, violations are being committed by India in some areas. But in a national address, Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif called the ceasefire an historic victory. And following US mediation efforts overnight, Sharif praised President Trump, who posted on social media, "I am pleased to announce a full and immediate ceasefire." He applauded both countries for using, quote, common sense and great intelligence. Well, the ceasefire has been welcomed across the region after days of deadly escalation. And these pictures, which are from Saturday, show a civilian home destroyed by Indian shelling in Neelam Valley in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Meanwhile, residents of Poonch, that's a town in Indian-administered Kashmir, are mourning 12-year-old twins killed by Pakistani shelling earlier this week. Now, the latest round of clashes has killed more than 60 civilians on both sides. And the question now, can the ceasefire last? Our South Asia correspondent Samira Hussain sent this report from Amritsar in India, less than 20 miles from the border with Pakistan.
This is how the morning began. Missile attacks by Pakistan, claiming significant damage, including Indian military facilities. A response to India's attacks the day before, wrecking buildings in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, killing several people. This violent and deadly tit-for-tat exchange over the last 4 days all started because of this attack last month. Gunmen shot dead 26 people in Indian-administered Kashmir, the deadliest attack on civilians in decades. India blamed militants operating in Pakistan, an allegation Pakistan denies. In response, on May 7th, India launched 9 targeted airstrikes aimed at what it believes are militant training camps operating in Pakistan-administered Kashmir and beyond. Pakistan says 6 locations were hit, but no terror camps, and that it took down 5 Indian planes, which India has not acknowledged. Kashmir has been in dispute since India and Pakistan gained independence, having fought 2 wars over the region. Kashmir, partially administered by India and Pakistan, but claimed in full by both. Complicating matters, a separatist insurgency fighting for an independent Kashmir for more than 30 years. Hours after the ceasefire agreement was announced, reports of explosions in Indian-administered Kashmir, India blaming Pakistan for the transgressions.
This is a breach of the understanding arrived at earlier today. The armed forces are giving an adequate and appropriate response to these violations, and we take very, very serious notice of these violations.
Pakistan, in turn, blamed India for breaching the agreement. But still, the country's prime minister went on television to say the ceasefire was for everyone's benefit.
We have acted as a responsible state for the world and regional peace and stability, and for the millions of people's lives in the region who gave a positive response on a ceasefire suggestion.
Keeping alive some hope the two countries may still avoid an all-out conflict.
Perhaps a sign that some ceasefire agreements can be fragile at the beginning, especially when talking about two very bitter rivals. Samira Hussain, BBC News, Amritsar.
Well, our correspondent Jake Kwan has this assessment of the US's involvement in brokering that ceasefire.
This announcement came as a surprise. For the last few days, it looked like Mr. Trump wasn't particularly interested in brokering peace here. He offered a few words of sympathies, but his Vice President J.D. Vance was on Fox News just a few days ago saying that if India and Pakistan were to go to war, it would be none of our business, and that U.S. will not involve itself in a war where it has no control over. Now, we don't know what had changed, but something has clearly changed, because we're learning that for the last 48 hours, Mr. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio were engaged with the leaders of India and Pakistan in earnest to try to broker peace. Now, what could have motivated the White House? Maybe that it is these two nuclear powers now engaged in a conflict, and that is slowly but currently slipping into possibly a full-blown war. And Mr. Trump is somebody who likes to present himself as a peacemaker, a deal maker. And since he got into the office, he tried to solve the problems, the major conflicts of the day. He tried to get a deal in Gaza and Israel. That did not happen. He tried to get a deal in Ukraine between Moscow and Kyiv, but that did not happen either. So with this one, if the ceasefire holds, Mr. Trump can really point to this as the first diplomatic victory for his second term.
Well, for more, I've been speaking to Rick Rosso, Chair on India and Emerging Asia Economics, or Economies, I should say, at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to you, Rick. Great to have you back on the programme. So a ceasefire was declared. I think it's fair to say it appears to be fragile. What do you make of it?
Well, it's great to see the Pakistan leader actually stepping out in public and kind of embracing, committing to it. You do have what appears to be shelling at the border. There's reports of Amritsar being hit, though we don't know exactly what kind of projectiles that is. Shelling, for these two countries along the border is a relatively typical thing in most times. So that wouldn't necessarily be considered a major abrogation of this ceasefire. If it's back to rockets, back to air power, back to drones, then things get a little bit more serious. So we're still waiting to see what's real and what's not with this latest reports, of course.
You mentioned that shelling and those reports at the line of control. Do you think both nations could potentially be prepared to draw a line in the sand in the coming days and say enough is enough?
I think so. I mean, Pakistan, at the end of the day, has very little chance of winning a real war with India. India, versus the last times they fought war, with which Pakistan was outmatched even then. The gap has only grown. India's become richer, more complex military equipment, a much larger military. So for Pakistan, I think putting up a fight, representing themselves after the terror attacks and India's attack, they felt they had to, but they can't win. For India, they don't want to get dragged into that, because this is a moment when India is attracting investment. They have good relations with the United States, trying to get a trade agreement. They just signed a trade agreement with the UK. So I think both sides, don't mind a bit of conflict, as long as it doesn't escalate too far. So I think the leaders would like to see this behind them if they can save face.
And I do wonder, of course, we have seen these civilian casualties over the past 4 days. We've also heard reports of celebrations in both countries when this ceasefire was declared. What is the feeling among civilians, the general public in both countries about where this could or could not be heading?
Yeah, with Pakistan, the big question is, how does this change civilian support for the military government, which was really in disfavor because they've really been limiting the access and visibility of former prime minister who's been in jail for 2 years now. And so the legitimacy of the civilian government versus the military, what's the population going to get behind, is a big question in Pakistan. Did this further empower the military? For India, the attacks that they suffered, the terror attacks that triggered this were horrific. They hit India much harder than the more recent terror attacks in 2016 and 2019, which targeted military. Disinformation has been a challenge because both sides aren't exactly clear what was transpiring, but in some sense could be actually what helps, because if both governments can convey to themselves, to their own populations, that they won, that they managed to come out on top, they had the last punch, then the populations might actually be comfortable and happy with how this concluded, if this is indeed the end.
And on an international stage, of course, we had those comments from President Trump. We know that the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, here in the United States has been working the phones on this. I mean, what do you think the motive there is for the United States? How far do you think they would be potentially willing to go in terms of arbitration if things don't calm down?
Well, India does not actually want foreign powers to come in and arbitrate in any meaningful way. They'd love to get it to, for foreign powers that have influence in Islamabad to get Pakistan to back down. But as the larger power, India is less interested in having a third party intervene in something, kind of longer term, the status of Kashmir or something like that. Right now we're talking a lot because of President Trump's tweet about the U.S. role. It was relatively limited. Here in D.C., we didn't see the United States being that active up until the last 24 hours. Other countries up until then, for instance, Saudi's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs was just in Islamabad, and we know that Saudi Arabia, with development aid and such, actually has probably a little bit more say and sway in Islamabad than the United States does. So I suspect the United States is getting a lot of attention because we were first to announce. But there's a lot of other players, particularly in Islamabad, that were probably putting pressure on Pakistan to agree to take the last punch, to step down and move forward.
Now, an opening day of trade talks between the United States and China has now wrapped up in Geneva, and in the past few minutes, President Trump has posted on social media calling it a very good meeting, saying that talks are expected to continue on Sunday. Remember that a trade war between the two countries was sparked by President Trump's decision to impose tariffs, which now stand at 145% on Chinese imports. Beijing, of course, has since retaliated with 125% import taxes on some US exports to China. It severely disrupted trade between the world's two biggest economies, which last year totaled around $600 billion. Well, I've been getting some analysis from Susan Shirk, a research professor at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy and the director emeritus of its 21st Century China Center. So these first day of talks then have wrapped up in Geneva. What do you think that they potentially might achieve?
Well, I think they could achieve the setting of an agenda for a series of negotiations, as well as a step toward de-escalating the tariffs and the Chinese retaliation against the tariffs. I mean, that would be the best hope, I would say. And so far, I'm rather encouraged because this looks more like a normal trade negotiation than what we had expected.
So no one should really expect both sides to walk away with a deal then at this stage. We did hear from President Trump signalling on Friday he might lower tariffs on Chinese imports. He wrote on social media, 80% tariff on China seems right. What do you make of that? What do you think Beijing will be thinking about that?
I don't make anything of that. I think the press secretary herself said it was just a number he threw out. So I wouldn't take the number very seriously. And the interesting question is what China would accept.
Yeah.
How much of a de-escalation will be a prerequisite for them moving forward.
What do you think they might agree to, and how dug in do you think Beijing is in all of this? Because they have already insisted that the United States should lift tariffs first. They have been adamant that they will be defending their interests.
Yes, but I don't think they made it a hard requirement of starting a negotiation that the United States drop all of its tariffs or drop the tariffs against China to the same level as the treatment of other countries. So both sides have flexibility here. I think the Chinese side has been preparing for two paths. One, the trade war, and you can see how quickly and with discipline and professionalism they retaliated against the extreme Trump tariffs. But I think they've also been preparing for a negotiated resolution of their differences. So I believe there must be a set of offers that they have prepared, put in the desk drawer for this very day. And so I'm feeling perhaps more optimistic than some of my colleagues that we might really get something going here.
Well, after those first day of trade talks between the United States and China in Geneva, we now have had comment from President Donald Trump there on Truth Social, as you can see. And what he says in that post is a very good meeting today with China in Switzerland. Many things discussed, much agreed to, a total reset negotiated in a friendly but constructive manner. We want to see, for the good of both China and the US, an opening up of China to American business. Great progress made. Now, before we go, a reminder of that breaking news on the war in Ukraine. In the past hour, Russian President Vladimir Putin has offered what he called immediate direct talks with Ukraine in Istanbul. We haven't yet heard reaction from Ukraine, but of course we will bring you more on that story at the top of the hour here on BBC News. Join me then if you can. Bye for now.